In September 1874, deep in the coal-scarred mountains of West Virginia, 3 armed men vanished near Elkhorn Creek. Days later, their bodies were found in shallow graves along the muddy banks, each struck down by gunfire from a weapon their killer shouldn't have been able to wield. The sole witness was 12-year-old Thomas Weaver, who emerged from the mountains carrying a rifle. Nearly his own height, his clothes torn and blood-stained, speaking with an unsettling calm for a child who had lost everything. Authorities buried the case as quickly as the bodies, but miners still whisper about the boy's cold, steady eyes and the 3 words he spoke when asked about the killings. They deserved worse. Official files remain sealed in the Mercer County Courthouse, marked only as matter resolved by mutual agreement. Further investigation suspended by order of Sheriff W. Thornton. What no one outside the mountains was meant to know was that the dead men weren't random victims. They were enforcers for the Consolidated Coal Company. And Thomas Weaver had just declared war on the most powerful corporation in West Virginia. The real horror wasn't what happened by Elkhorn Creek that night, but what followed as a boy's thirst for vengeance reshaped an entire region's understanding of fear. By autumn, the mountains had been transformed by an industry that devoured both coal and men. Communities that once lived by hunting, farming, and timber now trembled under the rumble of coal trains and the stench of dust and sulfur that choked the air. The Consolidated Coal Company's reach went beyond the mines, enforcing its own brand of law through its feared coal policemen without badges or uniforms, who decided who could shop work or even remain in their homes. Many were bitter ex-Confederates, war-hardened Union veterans, or drifters who found in corporate service a license for cruelty. They lodged in a decrepit boarding house known as Devil's Rest, plotting new ways to keep miners in line. Families like the Weavers, who had lived free in these mountains for generations, were trapped in a cycle of debt paid in company scrip, only spendable at overpriced company stores housed in shacks that crumbled with the seasons. Thomas lived with his father Samuel and brother Jacob in one of the last independent cabins built by his grandfather after the War of 1812. Inside the walls still bore the hides of animals long driven away by the mines. Samuel, a Union veteran, had hoped to return to farming after the war, but the company's arrival made that dream impossible. Each morning before dawn, he rose for his shift at mine number 7, waking his sons for a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses, sometimes with eggs from the few chickens that had survived the coal dust. Jacob, 17 and strong, carried the same broad shoulders and stubborn spirit as his father, but with a restless defiance that Samuel feared would one day bring trouble. Trouble that in the autumn of 1874 had already begun to find them. Jacob had been working as a timber setter for just 6 months, tasked with placing wooden supports to keep tunnels from collapsing, a job that demanded raw strength and unshakable precision. One misplaced beam could bury an entire crew. In that short time, he had already watched 3 men die in accidents that could have been prevented if the company had invested in proper safety equipment. When he complained about rotting supports that should have been replaced weeks earlier, his supervisor, a sly, sharp-nosed man named Garrett Mills, warned him that questioning company orders could get him fired and hinted that accidents happened easily to troublemakers. Thomas, unlike his father and brother, unsettled people in quieter ways. Small for his 12 years, he had an uncanny ability to read people, measuring their intentions, predicting their actions, like a chess player seeing moves ahead. While other children played, Thomas watched and learned. His mother Mary had died giving birth to him in the savage winter of 1862, while Samuel was away at war, leaving the boy to be raised by his grandfather Ezekiel. Hardened by the War of 1812 and decades on the frontier, Ezekiel believed weakness invited destruction. He trained Thomas to hunt, track, and shoot with a skill that astonished even seasoned woodsmen. The boy's rifle, a .44, caliber Spencer repeating rifle, one of the most advanced weapons of its time, had belonged to a dying Union soldier, Ezekiel, encountered during the retreat from Richmond. It held 7 rounds and could fire as fast as its lever could be worked, a devastating advantage over single-shot weapons. But Ezekiel's lessons went deeper than marksmanship. He taught Thomas to move silently through dense forest, read signs left by men and animals alike, find food and water where none seemed to exist, and think like a predator when survival demanded it. To Ezekiel, danger was not avoided, it was outmatched. By September 1874, the fragile balance in the coal fields had shattered. Wages had been cut twice that summer, while the company store raised prices on staples, trapping families in debt that tightened like a noose. Children went hungry, while company executives lived in grand houses built from miners' misery. In the mines, safety had collapsed, cave-ins came weekly, and refusing dangerous work meant blacklisting and often forced exile by the coal police. These enforcers were now bold enough to roam into independent settlements like the weavers searching homes, without warrants, stealing livestock, and delivering threats without ever saying the words. The spark that lit the fuse came on September 15th. That morning, Samuel Weaver walked into the choking darkness of mine number 7. With a folded petition in his pocket, the result of months of quiet organization and personal risk. Written in his own neat hand, on paper bought with money, they could barely spare it, listed, ignored safety violations, timbers splitting under unstable rock ventilation. So poor men collapsed from toxic air and equipment so faulty, it turned mining into a gamble with death. The petition also named the supervisors who had told workers that questioning safety meant termination and blacklisting. 47 miners had signed it, knowing full well it could cost them their jobs or their lives. These were not radicals, but men who had watched too many friends die, too many children waste away, too many elders suffer untreated illnesses because company doctors were ordered to keep costs down. Samuel intended to present the petition to Foreman Augustus Blackwood during shift change, when witnesses would be present and violence less likely. It was a careful plan rooted in the hope that reason might still prevail. But Samuel didn't know that one of those 47 signatures belonged to Henry Caldwell, a man so deep in debt to the company store that betrayal had become his only way to keep a roof over his family's heads. Caldwell's youngest daughter was dying of consumption, and the company made it clear her access to the doctor depended on his loyalty. Faced with choosing between the men he worked beside and his child's life, he made the only choice he believed a father could. By the time Samuel climbed down the wooden ladder into the shaft that morning, Augustus Blackwood already knew about the petition and had summoned the coal police. Blackwood, a foreman whose authority came from political strings and a readiness for violence, didn't see grievances, he saw rebellion. To him, the petition was a direct threat to the system that kept the mines profitable and the workers in line. When the confrontation came, Samuel spoke plainly, insisting the men sought only safe conditions, not conflict. Blackwood listened without expression, then tore the petition into pieces and let them drift to the floor. Every man who signed this paper, he said evenly, will report to my office after shift. Everyone knew such meetings ended with accidents if the men were lucky. Not showing up would be even worse. That night over cornbread beans and the rabbit Thomas had hunted, Samuel told his sons what had happened. He spoke of duty, the difference between courage and recklessness, and the choices a man might be forced to make. Jacob's answer was immediate fight back. Arm themselves, rally others. Thomas said nothing, only watching them both reading the truths they didn't speak aloud. Then came the sound of horses outside, slow, deliberate hoofbeats. Samuel rose, his hand brushing the knife at his belt, and peered through the window's coal-dusted glass. 3 men were dismounting with the easy confidence of predators, Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchinson, and James Crawford, the company's most feared enforcers. Finch, a former Confederate cavalry officer, led them with a cold, calculating cruelty. Immaculately dressed, despite the nature of his work, he carried matched Colt revolvers, worn smooth from use. Hutchinson, massive and scarred, thrived on brute force and the terror it bred a man who made examples when words failed. Crawford looked harmless, almost forgettable. But his unremarkable appearance masked a mind stripped of empathy. He killed without hate, without heat, just efficiency. Finch delivered the message Samuel was fired, and the family had 30 days to vacate their home, supposedly on land the company now owned. The claim was a lie. But in these mountains, lies became truth when backed by guns and corrupt courts. For years, the company had stolen land with forged documents, coerced testimony, and judges bought with bribes, erasing generations of ownership with the stroke of a pen. That night marked the last civil exchange between the Weavers and the Consolidated Coal Company. The company's theft of land often came dressed as official error, a miscalculated tax bill, a boundary line mysteriously redrawn. Jacob, hot-blooded and unafraid to speak his mind, asked what compensation they'd receive for the improvements they'd made over the years. It was a fair question, politely phrased, but it betrayed a fatal misunderstanding. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a show of force meant to break them. Hutchinson answered not with words, but with a backhand that slammed Jacob into the wall, splitting his lips and nose. It was the kind of violence designed to humiliate, without crippling, painful enough to be remembered, survivable enough to be retold. Samuel moved instinctively to help his son, and that was when Crawford stepped forward. Without a flicker of emotion, he drew his nickel-plated Remington and pressed the cold barrel against Samuel's temple. The 44 round in its chamber promised instant death, and everyone in the room knew he would fire without hesitation. "You seem to have forgotten who runs these mountains," Weaver Crawford said softly, his voice slicing through the silence. "Maybe it's time you and your boy learned some respect for your betters." What followed would carve itself into Thomas Weaver's memory, like letters chiseled into stone. As Samuel stood frozen and Jacob bled on the floor, the coal police calmly debated their fate as though they were haggling over livestock. Finch proposed making Samuel and Jacob vanish, leaving Thomas alive as a living warning. Hutchinson pushed for a public hanging, the bodies left swinging for all to see. Crawford, ever the pragmatist, favored the quiet approach. Take them into the mountains, bury them deep, and make sure no trace remained. Thomas watched from the corner as his father and brother were forced outside at gunpoint. From the window, he saw them being marched toward the tree line, Finch carrying a coil of wet hemp rope, Crawford with a shovel, Hutchinson hauling a canvas sack likely filled with lime. The boy knew with an icy certainty they were not coming back. But Thomas Weaver was not the helpless child they imagined. He had been preparing for this moment for years. As their voices faded into the forest, he moved with the same silent precision his grandfather had drilled into him. From beneath a loose floorboard by the hearth, he pulled out the Spencer rifle and its leather cartridge pouch, 47 rounds of gleaming .44 caliber ammunition, each one oiled, inspected, and ready. The rifle felt alive in his hands, the walnut stock worn smooth, the metal clean and ready to fire. He had shot it thousands of times, loading and emptying its 7-round magazine in under half a minute, hitting targets so small and distant that seasoned hunters sought his advice. But this night, he wasn't after game. He was hunting the most dangerous quarry in the mountains, men who killed for coin and pleasure, who had made the mistake of believing a 12-year-old boy was no threat at all. The darkness that the coal police thought would shield them was the same darkness Thomas had mastered over years of silent hunts and night tracking. He knew how sound bent and faded depending on the wind, how a single misplaced step could betray a position, how every deer trail, fallen log, and stone outcrop could be turned into cover or a vantage point. Most of all, Thomas understood the one truth his father and brother never fully grasped. Never let your enemy realize they're in a fight until it's too late to change the outcome. Finch, Hutchinson, and Crawford expected to kill 2 unarmed men without a struggle. They didn't know a third was stalking them, moving parallel to their path through terrain he could navigate blindfolded. Listening to their voices, Thomas guessed they were headed for Hangman's Hollow, a clearing by a creek where the land's grim history made it the perfect place for murder. Confederate irregulars had once hanged captured Union soldiers there, and bones still surfaced after heavy rains. The place was remote, private, and carried the kind of dread that kept curious eyes away. Thomas reached the clearing first, climbing to a rocky ledge screened by mountain laurel. From here he had clean sight lines to multiple positions and cover thick enough to vanish behind. He settled the Spencer rifle into a natural groove in the stone and waited. Below the coal, police stumbled forward with their prisoners, the forest slowing their pace. Hutchinson grumbled about the distance. Crawford discussed grave depth like it was routine. Finch mocked Samuel's petition, speculating about how the miners would react when they learned their leader had simply disappeared. In the starlit clearing, Thomas saw his father and brother bound, shoved toward a fallen oak that would soon be their grave marker. Hutchinson forced them to their knees while Crawford dug with practiced precision. Finch gave orders confident and unhurried. Thomas squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Spencer split the night, the .44 slug hitting Finch square in the chest and throwing him into the creek. The water boiled dark around him. Hutchinson and Crawford spun in confusion, shouting into the shadows. By then, Thomas had already slid from his perch to a new position. Lever down, spent shell out fresh round, in steady aim, squeezed 3 seconds. Hutchinson tried to drag Jacob in front of him, but the bullet caught him in the skull. He fell forward dead, pinning Jacob but leaving him unharmed. Alone, disoriented, and robbed of his advantage, Crawford bolted for the trees. It was the mistake Thomas had counted on from a man used to killing without fear of consequence. The last shot was the hardest. Crawford was nearly at the tree line, running in a weaving sprint, partially hidden by shifting branches. But Thomas had been taught to hit moving targets since he could shoulder a rifle running deer in thick cover, smaller and less predictable than a fleeing man. He led the target, compensated for the wind, and squeezed the trigger. The .44 slug struck between Crawford's shoulders, driving him face first into the muddy creek bank. His body slid into the same water that was already carrying away Marcus Finch's blood. For a moment the forest was still, except for the creek's quiet rush, and the ragged breathing of Samuel and Jacob, staring at 3 dead coal police and the boy who had just killed them. Thomas stepped from the trees, rifle cradled loosely, expression as calm as if returning from a morning hunt. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling to cut his father's bonds. His voice was steady, almost casual, no trace of panic, no flush of triumph. Samuel, still numb, could only stare. His youngest son had moved in darkness, found perfect angles, and eliminated 3 armed men with a precision few soldiers could match. More disturbing still, there was no hesitation. No moral conflict, just the simple logic of a problem solved. "They were going to kill you," Thomas said as he freed Jacob. "I couldn't let that happen." There was no anger in it, only certainty. What Samuel and Jacob didn't yet know was that Thomas had been preparing for this moment for months. The ambush site, the firing positions, the timing, it had all been rehearsed. The only surprise was that it had taken the company this long to come for them. By the creek, Samuel outlined a desperate plan, and Thomas sharpened it with an unnerving grasp of human behavior and institutional corruption. The coal police would be buried where they fell, their disappearance blamed on the dangers of their work. Samuel and Jacob would vanish, leaving signs of their own violent deaths. Thomas would remain behind, the sole survivor of a tragedy that never happened. It meant Samuel and Jacob would abandon everything, their home, their names, and any chance of returning to West Virginia. They'd travel under assumed identities to distant relatives who'd shelter them without questions. They would never contact Thomas again. He in turn would stay alone in a world that had already shown. It wanted him destroyed, armed only with his rifle, his mind and a growing conviction that survival demanded becoming more dangerous than any threat. Working by moonlight. Samuel and Jacob dug graves deep enough to keep scavengers away, shallow enough to finish before dawn. Thomas stood watch, listening for riders advising on soil and drainage, with an unsettling familiarity for burial work. The bodies were hidden beneath the roots of an ancient oak, covered in leaf mold and debris, the graves marked only with faint blazes on nearby trunks, signs invisible to strangers, but easy for Thomas to find. As the eastern sky lightened, Samuel took his son aside. "Remember that we love you. Remember this is to save lives, not just ours. And someday when you're ready, make sure no one can ever do this again." Thomas nodded with the solemnity of someone already thinking far beyond his father's words. His plans would go past survival into retribution. Back at the cabin, father and son staged the scene. Overturned furniture, Jacob's blood spattered to suggest a fight, possessions missing to imply trophies taken. Most damning, Thomas planted details that pointed to Samuel and Jacob being taken alive. 3 days later, hunters found him walking a mountain trail, rifle in hand, clothes torn and blood-stained. To Sheriff William Thornton, he was the perfect victim, calm from shock, coherent enough to help wounded only by loss. He told them the blood came from trying to help his father before the company men dragged him away, the torn clothes from fleeing in the dark. No one questioned his story. No one thought to. Sheriff William Thornton had survived Reconstruction by knowing when not to dig too deep. At 53, he'd seen enough corruption to understand that sometimes preserving the peace meant closing your eyes to certain truths. But the discovery of 3 bodies near Elkhorn Creek forced a choice he'd been avoiding. What should have been a straightforward case of corporate intimidation now looked like something far more dangerous. Finch, Hutchinson, and Crawford had been shot with the precision of a trained marksman, yet the only living witness was a 12-year-old boy who claimed to have fled in terror. The placement of the bodies suggested an elevated shooter, but the burial site offered few such positions. Thornton understood what this meant, yet also what it would cost to admit it. Under pressure from the company and mindful of his own survival, he crafted a report that turned the incident into a tragic dispute over mining operations. In his version, Samuel and Jacob Weaver killed the 3 enforcers during a fight, then fled the county. Thomas, found alone and traumatized, was the sole survivor. The story was neat, legal, and left no loose ends. But for those who knew what really happened, a few details wouldn't stop gnawing. The shots had been too perfect, the ambush too disciplined. And then there was Thomas himself, eerily calm, answering questions, with the kind of careful truth that concealed more than it revealed. "They came for Papa and Jacob," he would say. "There was shooting. I ran into the woods." The Consolidated Coal Company, now down 3 of its most feared enforcers, chose to let the matter die. Retaliation risked drawing attention to their own brutality. Better to bury it, make quiet policy changes, and move on. To Thomas, this wasn't mercy, it was weakness. And weakness demanded punishment. That winter, the mountains whispered new rumors. Company supervisors known for cruelty suffered sudden fatal accidents. A mine boss fell down a shaft he hadn't been near. A store manager was found dead in his locked office, the money untouched, a tiny puncture behind his ear. And in January 1876, Augustus Blackwood, the man who had torn up Samuel Weaver's petition, was found at his kitchen table, coffee still steaming, his face frozen in pure terror. The doctor could find no wound, no sign of forced entry, only catastrophic nervous system failure. Each man carried in his pocket a small scrap of paper bearing one word in a child's careful hand: justice. When Dr. Marcus Henley, the company physician, sent Thornton a letter detailing the pattern, the sheriff felt a cold certainty take root. This was no string of coincidences. Riding into the mountains alone following reports of campfire smoke in a remote valley, Thornton found the truth. Thomas Weaver had built a private war camp. Targets stood at varying distances, elevations, and angles, each one a likeness of a company man. There were obstacle courses for moving unseen firing positions, mapped to specific company buildings, and hand-drawn diagrams showing entry points, guard patterns, and kill zones. Every setup replicated real-world conditions, a place to practice perfect and prepare for the kind of justice the boy had already begun to deliver. These were not the makeshift targets of a boy's idle games. They were painstakingly carved human figures, anatomically precise, annotated with notes on vital organs, arteries, and the most efficient kill angles. Some swung unpredictably on rope and pulley rigs to mimic moving prey. More chilling still was the journal, a meticulous ledger of surveillance charting the daily routines, weaknesses, and fears of company employees. There were floor plans of their homes, schedules, and psychological profiles far too advanced for a 13-year-old. When Thomas stepped from behind the Mountain Laurel Spencer rifle in hand, with the easy familiarity of a veteran marksman, Sheriff Thornton was struck by the disconnect between appearance and presence. The boy was small, dark-haired, his face young, but his eyes and bearing belonged to someone long removed from childhood. "I've been expecting you, Sheriff," he said evenly. Dr. Henley was bound to notice. He's sharper than most of them. The conversation that followed laid bare the full scope of Thomas's war. He recounted each killing with the detached precision of an officer briefing a battle report. Garrett Mills had condemned men to die by ignoring safety complaints he'd fallen to his own accident in the mine. Vernon Polk had starved children and exploited their mothers. His own death had been slow and deliberate. Augustus Blackwood had caused the cave-in that killed Thomas's cousin. He died paralyzed by the same fear he once used to control others. When Thornton asked how a boy could manage such work, Thomas explained that Ezekiel Weaver had passed down not just hunting skills, but the knowledge of men who had survived war, frontier lawlessness, and a lifetime of threats. He had been trained not simply to endure danger, but to become it. Grandfather always said, "Sheep create wolves when they forget how to be sheepdogs," Thomas said. The coal company forgot what kind of people live in these mountains. The sheriff's most haunting moment came when he asked if Thomas felt remorse. The boy considered the question as though weighing a moral equation, then asked quietly, "Do you feel remorse putting down a rabid dog?" He described the men he'd killed as a sickness infecting the community. His actions as surgery, not murder. The only tragedy is how long it took. The endgame was not a firefight, but a negotiation by Elkhorn Creek, where the first 3 bodies had been buried. Thomas was not bargaining for his life, he was dictating terms. He demanded compensation for the families of miners killed in preventable accidents, the immediate installation of safety equipment, and the dismantling of the coal police. He insisted on written guarantees. "You think this ends with me leaving?" he told Thornton, his voice steady and commanding. "But I've already given them something they can't kill. Fear." 3 days of tense talks followed. Company executives, unable to find or stop him, agreed to every demand. But Thomas went further. He wanted proof of compliance, regular reports, and a network of miners' children who would watch, listen, and feed him information. The boy who had once been a hunted witness was now building an intelligence network, ensuring that the coal company would never again sleep without looking over its shoulder. After Thomas left West Virginia, the change was swift and unmistakable. Safety gear that miners had begged for suddenly appeared. Prices at company stores dropped overnight. The worst overseers were quietly reassigned, far from the coal fields, and the coal police, once feared like phantoms, vanished entirely. Their quarters at Devil's Rest abandoned mid-meal. But Sheriff Thornton soon learned Thomas's reach was more than fear. The boy had been gathering evidence for months, every unsafe shaft, every predatory policy, every family starved into submission. Before leaving, he compiled it all into meticulous reports that landed on desks in Charleston, Baltimore, and Washington, igniting investigations the coal company couldn't buy off. Letters from Ohio charted Thomas's shift from mountain avenger to respected businessman. He wrote of his studies, his rise in Cincinnati commerce, but between the lines ran a familiar thread of strategy, as if every success was still part of a larger campaign. By 1885, he had become the weapon Ezekiel Weaver had forged, hidden behind the mask of a civic leader. His holdings spanned mining equipment firms, railroads feeding coal towns, and banks that financed entire operations. His leverage was economic now, but just as precise. Miners across 3 states found quiet champions where they least expected them. Labor groups received sudden funding. Safety advocates found executives unusually cooperative, and mining families saw their children given scholarships that carried them far beyond the shadow of the company store. When Thomas died in 1924, hundreds attended his funeral in Cincinnati, honoring the philanthropist they believed they knew. Yet that same week, strange ripples moved through Appalachia. Plans to cut safety measures were abruptly abandoned. Union negotiations thawed overnight, and a handful of notorious mine guards disappeared without trace. Years earlier, in 1915, a flood had exposed the 3 graves by Elkhorn Creek, but the remains were dismissed as anonymous casualties of labor unrest. Investigators never found the 4th grave, hidden deep in the woods, holding Henry Caldwell, the man who'd betrayed Samuel Weaver's petition. Thomas had waited until February 1876, just before leaving for Ohio, to settle that final account. Sheriff Thornton carried that secret to his own grave in 1899. Only in his posthumous journals did the truth surface in a single, chilling note. The boy understood something the rest of us never learned. Evil creates its own nemesis. And sometimes that nemesis wears the face of a child who learned too early that mercy is a luxury the innocent cannot afford. Thomas Weaver had not been born a killer. He had been built step by step by the cruelty of men who never dreamed their prey might one day learn to hunt them.